Future Now show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Future Now show. Today, we're discussing open data and delivering the net zero future with Gavin Starks, founder of Icebreaker One. Hi, Gavin. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
So let's start by discussing net zero. What does net zero mean, and why is it important regarding humanity's future?
Well, I think unless you've been hiding under a rock for some time, you'll be aware that we have a climate emergency and that human-caused, or what's called anthropogenic emissions from our burning of fossil fuels has been heating the atmosphere and is causing global heating. The remedy to that is we need to decarbonize all of our industrial processes and our energy consumption and all forms of production. Now, net zero in that context means that the combined emissions from our activities need to be zero. Now, in some cases, we can reduce, so we can replace our fossil fuels with renewable energy like solar and so forth. But as part of that, we also need to work out how we can either sequester and remove emissions from the atmosphere or offset them in a credible way. So the net zero refers to the total being zero.
Right. Now, what are your thoughts about what's going on with this net zero issue right now? Do you feel like there's a lot of work being done, particularly to fight this?
Sure. There's a lot of work that's been underway for some decades now, but it's certainly accelerated in the last few years with a real focus coming from the financial sector and from regulated sectors, so governments again moving forward to mandate that we must get to net zero. So in the UK, for example, there's a legally binding target for the country to be net zero by 2050, and there's a number of countries around the world have signed up to similar pledges. So really, it's a requirement. It's not just a requirement from a legal point of view, but it's a requirement from a, if you like, an existential point of view, because we have to get to a net zero future. If we don't stay, certainly well within 2 degrees, but ideally 1.5 degrees warming maximum, then we start to see compound impacts on our atmosphere, which lead to dramatically increased weather events, which ultimately will destroy a lot of our infrastructure and destroy parts of our economy and a substantial threat to our survival.
Indeed. Let's talk about Icebreaker One. What is your organization? What do you do?
Certainly. So one of the challenges that everyone faces around driving towards the net zero future is how are we going to measure that? How do we measure progress? And in the conversations that we've had with people over many years now, is better access to data is an essential part of the equation here. And there's 2 broad categories of data. Data is quite a nebulous term, but let's try and draw it in to be something much more specific. If we think about what we call the real economy, so our industrial processes, manufacturing, and so on. If you're producing energy, you produce a certain amount of kilowatt hours. The source of that energy is really important. So is that energy coming from coal or nuclear or wind or solar? What you can do is you can attribute grams of CO2 or kilograms of CO2 to every kilowatt hour of energy production. And then you can track that information through the process of creating materials like steel or right the way through to products. So that when we think about the carbon footprint of our manufacturing processes, our industrial processes, there's a huge amount of inputs into those processes, whether it's energy or transport or materials and so on. So that's one element. The second element is when we look at the financial economy, and how do the financial markets, how do banks, how do investors quantify climate risk? How do they look at the potential for investment into net zero technologies or low carbon technologies, and how can they best measure and quantify companies in a way that will help us drive different credit ratings or different risk profiles around those organizations so that they get the right investment to drive to net zero. One of the interesting points about how we bring these things together is if you draw a parallel with, say, credit ratings, there's lots of credit rating agencies in the financial world, and they're now having to incorporate more and more other areas, broadly a category of ESG or environment, social, and governance data. But if we focus in on the environmental data, there's a real need to get high quality, trusted information from the real economy into the financial economy. So Icebreaker One is working on that data flow. We're trying to help work with organizations on both sides of that system, both parts of our economy, to say, how can we get better information directly from the manufacturing processes and the production processes, from the energy sector, from the water sector, and so on. And how can we get that to flow into the financial economy? What does the financial economy need that really represents materiality? What is material to those businesses and the decisions and the investment decisions that people are making? So we see it kind of really as an organization that can help commercial businesses come together and work out what data needs to flow and then help unlock those flows.
I see, right. It's absolutely needed at this time for more data, more organization, and certainly more effort, for sure. Now, when did your organization get started? When were you founded?
Sure, we set up in 2020, so we're an independent nonprofit. We're headquartered in London, in the UK, but working very much internationally. Working with international organizations and various governments around the world to say, well, look, what, again, comes back to what is the need here? What's the most sort of urgent thing that needs to be done, and how can we help working alongside other organizations that are looking in this into this area? And part of that is we've been in the recipients of government grants in the UK to help develop some of the data sharing capabilities, for example, across the energy sector. We're just starting in water now, as to building some of what we would call the data infrastructure.
Right. Now, what kinds of disruption are needed in order to make these changes?
So one of the ways that we think about this is if you look at the way that the web has enabled organizations to connect and enabled humans to connect, and the web is the most successful information architecture in history. There's now 1 billion websites, and that's happened in just a few decades. It's a really seismic shift. As part of that, it's been a lot of value creation, but there's also been a lot of monopolies sort of created along the way. When we look at the things that are evolving and changing and have been changing very rapidly, particularly over the last decade, you could look to the Internet of Things and the fact that there are sensors on pretty much everything now. And so there's a kind of web of data that has been emergent now for some time. And there's a lot of sensitivities around that information. You don't want to share your bank statements on the web openly. Equally, you don't want to share your energy consumption on the web openly. So we need mechanisms for people to share data that can't be open data, but does need to be shared with many different organizations in order that they can build the tools and services that help us drive towards net zero. So the kind of innovation piece here includes, so again, if you look at the way that industry tends to respond to the fact there's more and more data being produced, is the natural response is to try and put it all in one place, put it into a sort of big database, and then charge for access. But we're now seeing data coming from many millions, if not billions, of devices, and we're seeing many thousands of use cases and thousands of potential users. So part of this is to change the way that we think about sharing data, is rather than trying to put it all in one place and then charge for access, to say, well, the data exists in many thousands of different places. Can we work out what the rules are for data sharing and enable value exchange across those networks, so people can still get paid for their data, but really think about this in a decentralized way rather than a centralized way. So the innovation there is actually less about technology and more about the legal frameworks and the processes for data sharing, so that data can be shared across many different organizations with as little friction as possible.
Right. Now, you know, there's a huge push for EVs out there. And I know even our family, we got a Tesla, you know, and it was such a big deal. I mean, really kind of feels like you're in the future more, you know, having a EV, being able to charge it, you know, even in your house, in your garage. You know, it's just, there's a lot that's shifting here. Now, there's people on the other side that are, you know, concerned and saying, no, we need to stick with gas vehicles and X, Y, and Z. What would you say to people out there that are worried about this shift, you know, this net zero shift, you know, moving towards electric vehicles, as getting towards this future?
Sure. So one thing is to really get into the development of it. You know, in the UK, we've actually got again nationwide mandates to move away from fossil fuel based vehicles to electric vehicles. We're moving to a situation where we won't be able to purchase fossil fuel based vehicles in the next decade. So the shift is happening. So and this is quite a again seismic shift. But what it points to is that there's lots of change coming, but there's also lots of opportunity. And one of the challenges there in EV is a really good example where there's a lot of complexity in the systems that we're bringing on stream as countries. And the nature of energy production has shifted. So you might have solar and wind, even right down to domestic level. You might have a battery in your house and you've got a battery in your vehicle. And so that changes the way that the national grid works, you know, our national energy supply works. And so you have, instead of lots of centralized points like a big coal-fired power station or nuclear plant, you have those things as well as the sort of decentralized and distributed energy. So lots of questions then start arising there of, well, if I've got a battery sitting in my vehicle, on my driveway, can I power my house from my car as well as charge my car from my house? Or how would I charge my neighbor's car from my house or from my car? And so you can start to see this very quickly goes into what I would call a many-to-many connective world, where there's lots of potential connections that could be made and lots of different marketplaces that could exist and will exist around this kind of approach. But the challenge is, you know, how do you end up making something that works for everybody? So we don't want lots of different standards so that, you know, it becomes impossible to charge my neighbor's vehicle or whatever, and make it possible for us to really radically improve the connectedness of our energy infrastructure. And so that presents lots of challenges. I say, if you're trying to run a national energy infrastructure and a lot of it's driving around, you need to know where everything is. You need to know where what the charge is and all of those vehicles, and you need to know where all the charge points are. and you need to know, is there enough capacity for everybody to charge their vehicles? So when this starts to scale, it can get very complicated very quickly. But that all points back to the data. And so there are going to be millions of systems, millions of assets and vehicles and so on moving around. And the imperative then is to create what we would call interoperability between all those systems. So the data can flow between those different systems, but they need to also do that securely. They need to respect privacy. They need to respect intellectual property and all of those kind of pieces. So that, again, pushes us into a conversation about, well, if we've got this web of energy data, what happens to the data? Who has control over which bits when? And effectively, one of the ways you can ask that question is, what are the rights around that data? Who has the right to do what thing with that information? Some of it is going to be mandatory in terms of network management. Some of it will be essential to the driver. You know, you need to know how much charge you've got left and where you can charge and how quickly in order to get around. We can very quickly see that there's many thousands of different applications in this as well. So we're very much focused on that question of data rights and interoperability. How do we get the data to flow so that everybody can build these services and get them to scale?
Now, speaking of data rights, where are we at now compared to where we may be in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Where we are today is very much a kind of what I would call business as usual situation, where there's a lot of companies that have data and they're going out and basically saying we need to either protect our information or work out how we're going to monetize it, how we're going to sell it to others. There's also a lot of industry hasn't actually had to deal with very much data before. They haven't had to deal with smart meters. There was one energy company I was speaking to earlier this year, and they said, you know, you've got to remember our job until quite recently was to put cables on the ground and run cables. We didn't have a data strategy. Now we're putting smart meters on every single piece of infrastructure. So suddenly there's this data flow that is presenting us with, you know, billions of data points. That's a massive shift for an organization to deal with on its own. But it's an even bigger shift when everybody's doing it at the same time. So the challenge, if you like, is over the next decade or so, is we could end up in a situation where you end up with thousands of different systems, all built in slightly different ways, and that it's very expensive, both in terms of time and money and effort, to connect them all. Again, it comes back to the innovation that needs to happen. We need to really try and work on this together and develop common standards and common principles, not just technical standards, but legal standards and ultimately policy that governments can force the industry to collaborate effectively with each other, but without undermining the commercial value of the underlying information. So there's a lot of tension in this system. Lots of people trying to say, well, you know, my data is more valuable than yours, but we can navigate through that. We must navigate through those conversations in order to create a system that works for everyone.
Absolutely. So where are we at right now in terms of being able to address all these problems? What are some models, rather, that could be used to help solve it?
Yeah, so we're a lot of the work that we've been doing, there's a few different kind of waypoints that we've been basing our work on, and one of the significant ones is called open banking. Now, open banking is a standard now in the UK. It's regulated through the Financial Conduct Authority, and that mandates that all of the banks must have the same interoperability between them. So as a consumer, as a bank user, I can share my bank statements with a third party, like an accounting package, with 1 or 2 clicks. Right? So it doesn't require lots of contracts to be written between all the different parties. There's a common framework, common legal framework and a liability framework and a technical framework that enables the bank to share my data, my current account statement, with an accountancy package, and everybody's legally covered, and my own data rights. In this case, it's personal data, which is also covered by the EU regulation GDPR. It is all covered within the standard, and that applies to the whole of the retail banking sector in the UK, but it also applies to all the fintechs and the other companies looking to use that information. So there we've actually created a cohesive way of sharing data across a sector that has been incredibly scalable. Now, that was led by the UK government and Treasury 6 years ago, and got turned into regulation very quickly, within a year or two, and is now in play across the whole of the market. And because the standard was opened, so the open banking standard itself is openly licensed, bits of it have been copied in over 80 countries. So
Wow.
when we were setting up Icebreaker One, I was looking at that framework, and I helped to co-chaired the development of the original open banking standard. So when we were looking at setting up Icebreaker One, we thought, well, can we take that and use it as a blueprint for other sectors? So we're in the process now of rolling out open energy to enable the energy interoperability in a very similar way. And we've been working across industry with the network operators, with innovators and small businesses, with regulators, and with government to say, well, how would this translate? How could we use this sort of best practice here to drive forward innovation? And in the UK, this is in parallel to a digitalization process where the UK is trying to digitalize its entire energy system. Now, that's in terms of your question of what's the state of the world right now. That's the UK, which is a fairly advanced economy with a lot of existing systems that are quite mature, and we're still at the beginning of that journey. I think when we look to other territories, there are territories which are quite advanced in terms of their digital systems, but they're still very early on solving the mass scale interoperability question, and really how would that really get to scale? And obviously there's huge developing economies who haven't started yet. And so as countries start to deploy large scale decentralized and distributed energy systems, water systems, transport systems, all of these things need to be able to talk to each other in a really scalable way. But it really is, we're at the beginning of a journey, and it's going to be quite a steep climb.
Yeah, it's just wild because where we are right now, it seems that we're sort of speeding up to try to address the problems that we have now, while also taking into consideration what's supposed to be coming towards us. Now, it's pretty concerning, some of the projections of damage worldwide when it comes to this climate issue. How does this, how are they taking this into consideration? You mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that, if we go past 2 degrees, that's a very bad issue. So how are we looking right now towards that?
Well, I think that different lenses on that. So I was at COP a few months back, and going to the COP events is always a bit of a roller coaster, because you look at the science, you think, well, that's a pretty bad story, and then you look at the politics and you go, that seems like it's an impossible thing to try and achieve. So it can be quite demoralizing. We've got 9 years left before we can to try and hit 1.5. And we've probably got less than a 50% chance of getting to 1.5 now. So the latest projections are that we're, over likely to be like 2.7, 2.8, so that sort of range. Now that creates a lot of very negative consequences. However, the flip side of that, I'm always encouraged by the fact that, one, at COP, while the many criticisms of COP, and some of them are fair, but 40,000 people turned up to try and make a difference to this. And that included a lot of businesses and a lot of financial sector, as well as the political sphere. And when you look at what the financial sector is doing, there are now emergent international standards for greenhouse gas reporting and broader ESG reporting, which will become mandatory. So the regulators are starting to step in, and you'll see this coming from the SEC and other regulators around the world, mandating the disclosure of climate risk. And so the insurance companies and the pension funds and the wealth funds all have to now start really looking at what is in their portfolios, and the asset managers have to ask the question, what is in our portfolios and how are we going to help deliver net zero? Because if we don't, then we'll start to find that we can't get access to capital, or we can't get access to insurance. And so that drives some of the financial behaviors. So the challenge, or one of the challenges we face, is there's lots of great work happening around the world. There's development of different standards and taxonomies and reporting frameworks to enable this, the size of the problem, if you like, to be better quantified. The challenge is we've got to do this faster than we'd normally allow for this kind of systemic change. So the process of change, which normally would take many decades, we need to do really quickly. We kind of need to do it in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of scope for innovation here. And, there's a kind of common call here of everyone needs to do everything. It's not up to one group to try and solve all the problems. It's up to everyone to do as much as they possibly can over the coming years to try and accelerate this process. And from a financial or asset manager perspective, it's looking at the future security of your portfolio, right the way down to an individual. Quite often individuals feel completely disempowered. But one of the things that we can do as individuals is most people have pensions, or they have a bank account, or they have an insurance. Call up your pension provider and say, what is your net zero plan and how are you going to measure it? And most importantly, how is your executive pay linked to delivering those targets? Because the incentives need to be right the way through the, not just the institutions, but through the teams who run them as well.
Yes, certainly. Well, it's pretty interesting to see happen. I mean, I know earlier this year, I moved from New York City to North Carolina. And one of the last things that I noticed before I moved was the construction all along the East River, right? At the time, I didn't realize what it was. It just looked like some type of a beautification project. They were going to turn the docks into a beautiful park. I later discovered that it's actually a part of a project called the Big U. Have you heard about this?
I haven't, no.
So very interesting. Back in 2013, they came up with this project called the Big U. Now, the reason being is that Superstorm Sandy hit in 2012, and that hit New York City terribly. I mean, the entire tri-state area was without power for about 2 weeks, maybe even longer. And because of that, so much flooding, so much high waters came up, and this is unlike anything. It was unprecedented. Now, the reason being is that they said it was due to climate change. Is it this superstorm? It was supposed to be maybe a tropical storm or category 1 at most, but it combined somehow and became a giant superstorm and caused billions in disaster. So this U-Line project has been a direct response to that. What is concerning, going back to the need, past 10 years versus the next 10 years, is that it's been since 2013, almost 10 years now, since they've started this Big U project. It was supposed to go from the west side to the east side, a complete giant U, basically cupping the entire mid to bottom section of Manhattan. 10 years later, we're just starting construction. So
yeah,
it reminds me of your organization and what you're trying to help.
Well, I think there, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but the kind of approach that we need to take now, if you look at the climate science and the speed that we need to be moving, is a combination of the Apollo program, the Manhattan Project, and the Marshall Plan, which was used to reconstruct a lot of Europe after the war, all combined. You know, the scale of investment, the pace of change, the need to invest in infrastructure at scale, so that we can decarbonize our economy. And I think, you know, part of this is, you know, physics doesn't really care about our economy. It's not going to wait around until we've sorted it out. It just, you know, the weather systems are going to do what they do given the conditions. And so those kind of projects, we do need to mobilize quickly. It's been fascinating watching, you know, what happened during lockdown, of when we had a global crisis, which was upon us. Governments could act quickly. They could release funds quickly. They could shut things down or spin things up. And we relied on them to do so, to help address that crisis. One of the challenges with climate is always, people say, oh, it's kind of later. It's not this quarter or not this financial year, or not even within the horizon of this insurance program or this mortgage or whatever. Unfortunately, the consequences of that, we'll deal with it later, is it's not something you can fix. There's no vaccine, if you like, for the for climate. We can't just undo when things start getting bad, because the impacts play out over decades, and the impacts are also cumulative. So it's not the question, if you suddenly stop, if we stopped everything tomorrow, we'd still have emissions from what we've been doing over the previous decades. So we need to really find ways of incentivizing action here. And there's a massive opportunity for job creation. There's a massive opportunity to invest in this kind of future structure. And the kind of projects you're talking about there, you know, all of our coastal cities are at risk. You know, that's, you know, it's not just an issue for the global south or for developing economies. You know, Florida is a good example. The ground in Florida is porous, so building a flood defense isn't going to help. So when, not if, but when the next really substantial storms hit, you know, there'll be a whole range of things that go out of business there. And as that risk profile increases, insurance companies will stop insuring. If I was running an insurance company, I wouldn't be insuring any properties on the coast of Florida at all. You know, and there'll be a point there where, if you can't get insurance, then that changes the nature of the economy in which your buildings are sitting, and that can have a cascade impact on the economy. So you might see economic collapse in some of these areas before the climate hits. Or we can wait until the climate issue or the weather issues hit and destroy big bits of infrastructure, and then we'll have, you know, the capital losses as well. But, you know, I think all of these things point to, we've got to incentivize the right behaviors here, right the way through the system, from the political system, macroeconomic elements, right the way through to how do you get a loan? Can you prove that that loan is going to drive towards green outcomes? Right the way down to individual actions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's got to change. I've seen that in Florida and what's going on down there. They're still building like crazy, and you know,
I think there's an expression in the financial system called stranded assets. And I'd say anyone building on the coast of Florida they're building stranded assets. Now, they might have done a risk profile saying, well, we can sell it to somebody else in the next 5 years, so we will take the risk. But who's going to buy it? That's good, and I certainly wouldn't be buying them. So I think there's a lot of tough questions. These are not easy. There's no easy solutions here. There's no kind of silver bullet to address a lot of these things. But so we need to both, you know, decarbonize our economy. We need to build for resilience. We need to work on making our infrastructure and our environments more secure. And we need to prepare for, you know, fairly systemic change. But at the heart of this, like, there's a massive kind of opportunity. If you think back to when we were creating the Industrial Revolution, we spent 2 to 3 times of our GDP creating the railways, creating the roads, creating the infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution. It's that scale of project that I think we're embarking on. And you can see that through the scale of investment. When we first started talking about Icebreaker, people were talking about billions being invested, or hundreds of billions are being invested. Now people really only start talking about trillions or tens of trillions. So that gives a sense of the scale of the interventions that are needed.
Indeed, there's a huge need for investment right now in infrastructure all around the world, especially in America. I mean, one of my biggest hopes when I think about net zero future and emerging tech and all these promises that we've heard over the past 10 to 20 years about where we're going to be heading. I mean, one is probably the Hyperloop. The concept of having not just high speed rail, but having this more advanced, cleaner transportation that could potentially wrap around the entire world. But the problem is that, again, it's been out for about 10 years. It's been being worked on, but yet we're not quite seeing it yet. So what can people in the public do to help support all of this, help drive change?
I think one of the things about consumer and sort of citizen engagement here is, I've been involved in the climate sort of change agenda for over 15 years. And when it started, there was a lot of things, well, just, fly less or change your light bulbs or, turn your heating down a degree and things like that. And it's very hard, I think, for any of us to feel like changing a light bulb is somehow saving the world. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it doesn't necessarily give us that sense of agency. Certainly looking at the big areas where, our individual consumption makes a difference. Yeah, turning your heating down or your cooling down by a degree or two does make a difference. So if don't overheat things, don't be wasteful. I think in the mix here, we've also got to think about what travel looks like in the future. If we're doing this video conference, the footprint of this video conference is very substantially less than us getting on a flight to go and meet each other. So where possible, we should be replacing things, and it's a bit easier as well. You don't have to trek to the airport and spend thousands getting from A to B. So we should be doing that by default, right? And actually, the whole lockdown process has accelerated that. Everyone's realized actually it's possible to do far more by video calls than we might have imagined. But people are still going to want to travel. So as a consumer, is it reasonable to say, well, let's stop traveling? Well, no, it would be my view. But what we can do as consumers is ask questions to the people that we're buying products and services from. We can write to and talk to our politicians and governments and say, this is important to us. One of the challenges that businesses face and governments always face is, do they have permission really to do something? They don't want to enter into trying to create a change where they're going to see a lot of resistance, and they're always worried about their reputation. But maybe to illustrate with a pension fund, when you go into a company, you can talk at the most junior level, and individually everybody wants to do something and say, oh yeah, but it's up to the managers. And the managers say, well, it's up to the middle management. The middle management say, well, it's up to the VPs, and the VPs say, well, it's up to the C-suite. And the C-suite says, oh, it's up to the chief exec. Chief exec says, well, it's up to the board. The board says it's up to the shareholders. And the shareholders say, well, it's up to our investors, who are the pension funds. Pension fund says, well, it's up to the people we represent, which the pension fund holders. So you're right back at the beginning of that story. So it really is a nice cycle there where everybody in that chain needs to be asking the question, what can I do? And who can I ask that has agency in this? And that comes back to the question. One of the most powerful questions I think we can ask is, what is your net zero plan and how are you going to demonstrate to me that you're going to hit it? Because if you're not, I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch provider. I'm going to switch product. I'm going to switch vehicle. I'm going to vote for somebody else. This is really, it's the kind of most pressing issue of our time. And we face many crises. There's biodiversity issues, there's species collapse issues, there's a whole range of water issues and related things. If we get to the point where we start to really materially address net zero, it is a bit of an umbrella for a lot of those other issues. And by doing so, we can create patterns where we can say, well, look, if 1 million people called up their pension provider and said, we really want you to do something, don't invest in fossil fuels anymore, that would give a mandate, that would give permission to the pension fund board to make a decision. Because quite often the processes, these are regulated industries, the processes around making investment choices has to maximize on monetary value. But the question there is monetary value over what time frame? If you're going to have a whole bunch of stranded assets, the value of your pension fund will collapse if the impacts of climate change are brought to bear. So it's a better investment decision. But right now, there's a lot of work to do to really shift that juggernaut. And it is changing. It's just not changing quickly enough. So maybe to frame it, I have 100% confidence that we're heading towards a lower carbon future, but I have currently 0% confidence we're heading to net zero.
That reminds me of my favorite last question to ask, which is, what might life look like in the year 2050?
Well, 2050, I think it's going to be pretty complex, I think, is one of the things. We've got going to have a lot of pressures on different parts of our economy and our ecology, on our societies. It's not just an environmental set of crises here. The hopeful view, maybe I'll start with the negative view. The negative view is that we don't move quickly enough, and we start to see more and more environmental catastrophes, and we see more and more extreme weather events and flooding and so on, and that they lead to mass migrations. And that those mass migrations will quite naturally lead to conflict. And so you end up in a more of a protectionist type of world where people are putting up walls. And that's a very negative spiral. When you start playing that through, it gets worse rather than better. So we need to avoid that. So the hopeful view then is that we accelerate the investment in net zero, in addressing these systemic challenges that we face. And we use, it's like never waste a good crisis. Use the crisis, or crises, plural, that we face to invest in building the next generation of infrastructure, and building the new jobs of the future, and building the new organizations of the future. And we could draw a parallel here between going back to the early days of the web, where people were like, what's this for? And now I think it's 9 of the top 10 richest companies on earth are technology companies. And you go, well, what in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now, why wouldn't they all be net zero companies? Companies that have really driven the net zero revolution and employing millions of people.
You're right. It's going to be interesting. That's a really, really, really great response. Where can we learn more about Icebreaker One? Where can we find your website? Where are you on social?
Sure. So just icebreaker1, all one word, .org. And similarly on LinkedIn, just Icebreaker One, and similarly on Twitter and other socials.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Gavin, for coming on today and sharing this very important topic that must be addressed very sooner than later. And yeah, until next time, thank you and stay tuned for the future.
Thank you very much.